Hello and welcome to The Federal. You're watching Off the Beaten Track, a program in which we take a 360-degree view of an issue that we pick up for discussion. Indian elections are due very shortly, within a month, or maybe even less time than that. The Election Commission for India would have announced and called for elections, announced the dates where people are going to vote in phases, the date of counting. So we will know that by when we will have a new government. A new prime minister or not, we do not know at that time, at this time, but that is it. For the first time in these elections, it appears that foreign policy of the government, the image of India, these are going to be issues which are going to be figuring in the elections. Opinion polls conducted by various media houses suggest that of the people who have already decided that they are going to vote for the Narendra Modi-led Bharatiya Janata Party, a large number of them would do so because they say that he has enhanced India's pride and respect in the world. That India is now, the Indian passport has greater respect. That is, in fact, one of the jargons which has been created in the last 1 decade. Now it's already a decade since Mr. Modi has been Prime Minister. So I will be talking to Professor Ian Hall. He is an Australian. He is a professor at the Griffith University and also fellow at the India-Australia Institute, someone who keeps writing on Narendra Modi and the Indian government's foreign policy, the directions it is taking, what it means, and somebody who's also written books on the subject. Welcome to the program, Professor Ian Hall. I am taking the liberty of calling you Ian. You please call me by my first name, Nilanjan.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Nilanjan, and a great pleasure to be able to talk to you.
I have been actually wanting to speak to you for long, but somehow or the other, it suddenly materialized that with the elections just about to be announced, there couldn't have been a better timing than this. I mentioned about the opinion surveys, that India's respect and prestige has been enhanced greatly by Mr. Modi. Your take on this? Do you think this has actually happened? That India is now greater respect and people are fearful of the country as a whole?
Look, I do think that there's a large section of the Indian electorate that is convinced that India now stands taller in the world. And I think in that sense that the government's done quite a good job at kind of instilling this greater confidence, I suppose, in parts of the population. The difficulty is for somebody like me who's a scholar is that it's quite hard to measure this in empirical terms. So we don't have any really good, strong international evidence to suggest that India is more respected or more paid attention to by other countries in the world. We've just got, if you like, these claims and counterclaims. All of that said, though, I think foreign policy is one of those areas where this government has probably done better than it has in some areas of domestic policy. And it's not to say it's been hugely successful across the board and in every single area, but I think it is fair to say that there have been some successes in that particular area. So I can understand how that impression was created.
Right. You have also pointed out in one of your articles, an introduction to a book which you edited along with, other scholars, that in India, we have generally seen prime ministers and foreign policy, they are not really discussed much. It's supposed to be what in Indian journalism we used to call holy cow. You're not supposed to touch it. Defense and foreign policy in the years that I was stepping into journalism were considered to be holy cows. You just kind of faithfully report what the government wants it to be publicized. That is why the prime ministers have had a certain amount of elbow room. Do you think Mr. Modi has had a greater amount of elbow room, or he has been able to secure the interest of people, of the ordinary people who don't understand anything about foreign policy, but greater interest in what he is doing? They at least see for that Mr. Modi, when he goes out, he is very, very visible, and he's very, to use the right word, very careful about one eye is always on the camera. Now, how do you think that this is actually played out in actual foreign policy?
So I think that abroad, just as at home, Mr. Modi is quite masterful in his public relations. So he knows the power of the photograph on the White House lawn. He understands the power of the image surrounded by the diaspora, whether that's in Sydney or it's in London or it's somewhere else, or indeed just now in Abu Dhabi, just on the latest trip. He's been very good, very adept, and the party has as well, at bringing along journalists who have been using kind of traditional media, but also like television and radio, to convey these images. But they've also been using social media to take their own photographs, to create their own images of all of these kinds of events. And so rather than just using international meetings or summits just for the diplomacy and the public relations being incidental to that, what this government has done and what Mr. Modi has been very successful at is turning each one of those into photo opportunities, into the generation of an image, which puts him center stage, and which gives the impression that he's very much respected and taken seriously and so on, which is not to say that those things aren't true, but there's a very clever public relations exercise around all of this.
Okay. You mentioned the event in Abu Dhabi, where he interacted with the diaspora. This actually brings me to two questions. So I'll first ask the one, related to the diaspora. In fact, the engagement with the diaspora has been a completely new area which Indian prime ministers, Mr. Modi has done, which no other previous prime minister did. Starting from his visit to the US in September 2014 and the event in Madison Square Garden, where Mr. Modi actually appeared as, what many people, including I, wrote, not really the Prime Minister of India, but as really the leader of the Emperor of the Hindu hearts. That is one of the old, images of Mr. Modi right after the 2002 riots. So he was addressing the Indian diaspora, not just as Prime Minister, but also as a leader of the global community of Hindus everywhere. He's done that in Australia also, we have spoken in the past. So how do you think that this empowering the diaspora in a way, that giving them a certain block, and that's possibly also sending a message to leaders in other countries that, look, here is a vote bank, I'm using a phrase of Indian politics, vote bank, which I can somehow or the other influence. He did so with that show in Texas with Donald Trump next to him, way back in 2000, a few years ago, 2008, 19, if I'm correct, that when Howdy Modi, that was the event which was done. But essentially that because he has tremendous following in the diaspora, becomes to be, and who are voters of that country, has a definite impact there. So, how does this play out in those countries? That's my question.
I think it plays out in a number of ways.
Yeah.
I think there's no doubt that the impression is being given that the diaspora is valued by India and that ought to be valued by host countries, that it ought to be taken seriously, and that it ought to be taken and treated as representatives of India, that he is acting as a protector in some sense, but also that he's looking out for their interests as well. So there are multiple messages being sent in all of this diaspora engagement. And of course, the last one of all that's really important is saying to the diaspora, India still matters to you. So I want you to commit yourself back to India. I want you to donate money to the BJP. I want you to tell your family back home to vote for me. And I want you to bring back and invest your money in the country, as well as to invest your money in my political future.
Right. You also mentioned about the current visit of Mr. Modi. He's gone to the UAE. He's also going to Qatar. This is the same time, around the same time that the release of the 8 naval retired officers has happened. A lot of critics would actually make harsh comments that this has been timed in a way that it comes just before the elections. After all, they were sentenced a long time ago, but the government waited for it to actually extract a maximum electoral advantage. But leaving that aside, we really cannot say whether the government actually delayed the process and wanted to time it with Mr. Modi's visit to Qatar. Uh, what do you think that this government has acted more proactively in this particular episode than what the previous governments would have done, given your understanding of the tone and the capacities of the previous government's foreign policy? What do you think about it? Anything different?
I think where this government's been very interesting in terms of its engagement of West Asia, of what Westerners might call the Middle East. It's been concerned about that engagement for lots of geopolitical and geoeconomic reasons. So it's interested in bringing investment money from that part of the world. It's interested in its energy resources, of course. It's a really important trade hub. But this is the location of a very large number of overseas Indians, of members of the diaspora. And again, they are important because of the potential influence that they have in their host countries and in India itself. But they're also an interesting population because many of those are Muslim Indians. They're not necessarily Hindus. And so this has been a kind of curious episode where I think the government has tried to demonstrate that it is concerned about their welfare, and often their welfare is not well looked after in that part of the world. And so it's trying to actually broaden its appeal, if you like, past its natural constituencies into other areas as well. So there's a number of different dimensions to all of this that I think are really interesting. That said, there's no question that in terms of opening the latest temple or the first temple in Abu Dhabi, this is a direct appeal to the Hindu population, but there is a broader bit of messaging going on there as well to others from India that reside in that part of the world.
Right. We are talking about West Asia and the fact that West Asia has been very turbulent over the last 1 year. How do you assess, if I can actually put it very directly, how do you assess India's response, the response of the Modi government to the Israel-Hamas conflict?
I think this is where the government has found itself in a bit of a difficult situation, and so far it seems to have managed this situation reasonably well. But there's always the scope for kind of rapid deterioration. The Modi government, as the BJP earlier government of Vajpayee's government, this government has really grown very close to Israel. Mm-hmm. It shed some of its previous kind of attachment to Palestine and to the Palestinian cause. It's managed to do that without alienating most of the Arab countries and also Iran in that part of the world. But at the same time, it's been able to do that under some quite advantageous circumstances. While we've seen the process leading up to the Abraham Accords, for example, while we've seen a kind of almost a normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. So it's been a kind of situation where India's been able to take advantage. Now the situation has changed and it's fast evolving. And India's approach, which is to try to be friends with more or less everybody in the region equally, but to lean into this relationship with Israel, I think that's coming under strain. But it's not clear to me yet exactly where that's going to end up.
India has also had to do a certain amount of balancing act on the other conflict which has been raging in the world for the last, more than a year, almost 2 years. That is, Russia and Ukraine, So how do you look at the Modi government's approach to that issue, whether they have been actually been able to balance between the conflicting forces or not?
I think that the government has been quite cold, if you like, quite realistic about calculating India's interests in this. I think to some degree, though, it's underestimated some of the irritation in Western capitals about India's ongoing refusal to condemn Putin's invasion. That irritation has not gone away. It was there right at the beginning of the invasion. It still is there in Washington. It's coloring some of the calculations that are being made by Western countries. But India decided early on that it had, it does have that important defense relationship and energy relationship with Russia, and it wants to protect that. And India as well, you're just coming out of COVID. I think that's important. The context is important here too. The Indian economy suffered terribly under COVID, and it needed to recover strongly in 2022 and into 2023. And an economic crisis like that was provoked by the invasion, particularly a big bump in the oil price, really threatened that recovery. So India needed to tread very carefully, and I think its approach in staying relatively close to Russia and then also buying up a lot of cheap Russian oil was kind of sensible economically, even if there was some diplomatic damage done in terms of the non-condemnation, if you like, of the invasion.
There is something about, foreign policy, the Indian foreign policy, if we look at, in the past, even beyond Mr. Modi's tenure, there is something as we journalists, who were not really writing on foreign policy, we always felt, that India was doing very fine, as far as being the conscience keepers of democratic forces in the country. But over the last few years, especially in Mr. Modi's, especially during Mr. Modi's tenure, India has kind of abrogated its role in terms of, being the preserver of the democratic spirit in the world. Would you also get that kind of a sense, what is your understanding of the issue? That we don't speak up as much as we used to speak up at some point.
Yes, I think that's true. And I think, look, the government still, New Delhi, when it's talking on a broader international stage, it still talks about democratic values. It still talks about these shared values. But whether it supports those or not, like for all countries, it makes cold-hearted calculations about where to support these values and where perhaps to leave them to one side. So, the contrast in South Asia would be between, say, Afghanistan and what's going on in Burma, Myanmar, where India was very quick to speak up in defense of the pre-Taliban government, the democratically elected government in Afghanistan, I think for good reason. But when it comes to what's gone on in Myanmar and the junta and the civil war, it's been much more reluctant to act. And you can see similar dynamics working out in Nepal and Sri Lanka, elsewhere in the region as well. So I think it's there in South Asia where this, you come up against hard realities, and there you can see that there's inconsistency. Now, I'm not, Australia does very similar sorts of things in its own part of the world. It's very hard to maintain these kinds of balances, but there's no question, I think, that India has pulled back a little bit over the last decade or so.
Right. So what you are basically saying that India has essentially been more self-centered or looking after its own interest a bit more than what the previous government used to do. That is what we have seen since 2014. There's another question in my mind, which I've had for a long time, especially after 2019. We have a foreign minister who has been in the foreign service and served there for about 3 decades or maybe even slightly more before retiring. And then after a short stint in the private sector, came into government as minister. This has been different from the previous practice of diplomats joining politics, becoming part of a party, the ruling party, becoming ministers too, but then not going into their original, the core sector, where they spend, because saying that they carry a lot of baggage. This has been obviously abandoned. So the direct question is that, what do you think of this? What is your viewpoint as far as making the shift is concerned? And also, does Dr. Jaishankar carry any baggage? Did he bring any past perceptions as far as his role in various capacities in the Indian Foreign Service?
I think Dr. Jaishankar's role in defining and explaining, defending India's foreign policy has just been absolutely critical. If we look at to go back to 2014, if we look at the first 6 or 7 months of the Modi government's handling of foreign policy, it really lacked a very clear narrative. It lacked a clear structure.
That's right.
And it was really when Dr. Jaishankar came in as Foreign Secretary at the end of January in 2015 that we started to see that structure being imposed. And that has continued onwards over the last 9 years or so, that he's, barring that period where he's in the private sector, where he's been more or less in control of India's foreign policy. I think he's tried very hard to bridge, if you like, India's traditional concerns in foreign policy with the concerns of the ruling party. So he's tried, he's written 2 books on this subject, he's given many speeches on this subject. He's tried to bridge a gap that I thought personally was actually quite difficult to bridge between a kind of a conception of foreign policy that was really defined in the post-colonial period, dare I say it, by Nehru and his coterie, and that continued and rumbled on all the way through into the 1990s. And so he's tried to take some elements of that and to blend that in then with some of the language, some of the presentation, some of the aspirations that the BJP has. It's a slightly unstable thing ideologically, but in terms of the approach, the strategy that he's put in place, it does have a lot more clarity than it had 10 years ago. And I think on balance, it's been relatively successful insofar as any foreign policy can be successful.
So, if I, try to frame this question this way, that given the fact that what you are saying, that after the initial kind of, not being very sure that what he really wanted to do with foreign policy, although Mr. Modi, I just would want to point out something that we tend to forget, that he was asked about foreign policy issues, even during the campaign. And in fact, in October 3rd, 2013, when he was not Prime Minister, he was still campaigning for that, not even had become the BJP, Prime Ministerial candidate. He was asked during the campaign, and he said that his exact quote, that India's foreign policy should be built on the foundation of our culture, tradition, strength, economy, trade, strategy, and security. There he goes into the traditional, the standard foreign policy jargon, strength, economy, trade, strategy, and security. But our culture, tradition, how much of the shadow of Hindu nationalistic politics have you found on Mr. Modi's foreign policy?
That's a subject that we could talk about for an afternoon, I think. I think
we will give a teaser, to our viewers, and then say that, depending on the number of hits and views we have, we will come back and have an afternoon discussion on this.
So look, I think there's, in a way, there's less and more, if you like. So I've written extensively about this, and my feeling is that if we go back and we look at the ideological tradition, if we look at some of the great writers of the Hindu nationalist tradition, they didn't say a great deal about foreign policy. They said that that India needed to kind of achieve its rightful place in the world, and that it needed to transmit its great cultural legacy to others, as they interpreted it. But that was pretty much it. They didn't have a kind of a strategy. They didn't have a sense of means. They had an understanding of ends, but not an understanding of means. I think that if we look at the current government's foreign policy, I think we can see that the declared ends are not dissimilar to that. So a sense of India's greatness, of its destiny, of its importance in the world, and a sense of that the BJP would like the world to recognize that great Hindu civilizational legacy as they interpret it. They want that. The issue is, how do you go about achieving that? And here the path becomes much more winding and unclear. if we look at again, back at those great ideologues of the Hindu nationalist tradition, they're profoundly anti-Western.
That's right.
But yet, what we've seen over the last 10 years is India draw closer to the United States, in particular into a kind of mutually beneficial partnership, and away from forming a kind of an anti-Western partnership with China. And in Dr. Jaishankar's recent book, he explicitly says we must not become anti-Western. There's a pathway here where we need to walk alongside with the West in partnership in some areas and work with the West in order to achieve our own objectives. Now that's quite a profound difference, I think, from some of the earlier understandings. So that means ends issue, I think, is really important in understanding what has happened over the last decade.
Right. You, in one of your answers, you were talking about the early part, the right in 2014. Now, one of the first things which Mr. Modi did in 2014 was obviously, he sprung the surprise of inviting the, heads of the government from the neighborhood, from the SAARC countries. What has been the state of India's neighborhood policy? That is something which actually requires an assessment from you. There's also something, about China related, which I will be coming to. But I first want to hear from you your views on Mr. Modi's neighborhood policy, with Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, the entire Maldives, at the moment, there is a peculiar kind of a crisis brewing there at the moment. And he also tried to hit back domestically by going to Lakshadweep, and then that huge storm which came up in social media, that the Indians will boycott Maldives as a tourist destination.
I think that, I'm of the view that, every Indian government needs to put the neighborhood first. Partly just, I think it's the right,
Didn't really.
Right thing. Sorry?
It created a slogan, the neighborhood first, but we really do not know whether it was first or later. We really don't know.
Right, exactly. I think at the same time, part of the reason why the neighborhood has to be put first is that the neighborhood is extremely difficult to manage. It is pushed and pulled in all kinds of different directions. You've got a series of states which are in varying levels of stability and fragility. You have great poverty in parts of South Asia that are not comparable with other parts of the world, and a horrible lack of connectivity as well, which are chronic problems. But in terms of the score sheet, if we look at what has happened over the last decade, I think India has had some achievements. I think the relationship with Bangladesh, for example, is much stronger than it was a decade ago. But it's had some real setbacks as well. So setting aside Afghanistan, I think in Nepal, India did quite well initially, and then we saw that informal blockade, and that caused some significant problems, and it was capitalized upon by China. In Sri Lanka, we've seen ups and downs, some of which is domestically related, some of which is related to China. And you can't say with any confidence, or at least I can't say with any confidence, that India will retain a very strong relationship with Sri Lanka for the next decade or two, just because things are too volatile. Again, in the Indian Ocean, we have similar kinds of dynamics. The Myanmar situation is another one that I think is brewing away and could become quite problematic for India. But all of these things there are some areas where I think we can point a finger at the Modi government and say, look, mistakes were made. And I've mentioned the Nepal blockade as an example. Definitely. But elsewhere, there are things that cannot be controlled. And I think, say, with Pakistan, if we remember back around Christmas time at 2015, Mr. Modi made a surprise trip to Pakistan, to Nawaz Sharif, to a family wedding. He tried to make an effort to build a kind of personal relationship with the Pakistani leader. And so there were these efforts made up till 2016, 17 to try and forge a different kind of relationship with Pakistan, or at least to explore it. But for internal dynamics within Pakistan, I think made that impossible. And it's a good reminder that I suppose, and again, there's a comparison here with Australia. Australia would like to think that we have, a happy family in the Pacific, but the reality is that often the family isn't happy with us, and we don't control what happens in the region, and it's a very challenging thing to manage.
But India was also very, Mr. Modi personally was very proactive, when it came to striking back when there were terrorist strikes. We are talking about the strike in Uri in 2016, and then again in, that terrible terrorist attack on the 14th of February 2019, which led to India actually sending its fighter jets back there, and it could have actually snowballed into a huge security crisis for the entire world, but somehow or the other, it ensured at least Mr. Modi's return to power in 2019. And the message being conveyed by them domestically is that Modi's government is more muscular. It knows better than previous governments how to protect its borders and its interests outside. We Indians, generally speaking, consider a civilizational problem more with Pakistan than with China. That is why the denial of whatever has happened vis-a-vis between India and China has got accepted, not really become a major issue with the people. But an assessment from you that how muscular we have been under Mr. Modi.
Look, I think India is more muscular. It's been more keen to use military power to demonstrate its resolve in certain situations. That said, India has remained quite restrained in other areas as well. So, and the effectiveness of those demonstrations of resolve are always questionable. They're very difficult to measure. So, we've seen incursions, we've seen terrorist attacks continuing across the line of control. They haven't been fully deterred. And, I personally think it's extremely difficult to deter these things with conventional military force. But it's not to say that we saw after 2019 no more kinds of attacks happening. We've seen that rumbling on afterwards. With China, that's where I think, again, the Modi government has really struggled to come to grips with China, and partly for reasons far beyond its control. It was not, the Modi government inherited a situation which was already deteriorating. It inherited a situation in which China was already had an economy 5 times the size of India's. Mm. Whereas if we go back to, even to 1980, they're comparable in size. So this gap had opened up. There had been some neglect of military modernization in India and so on. There had been neglect of infrastructure along the border areas, the frontier areas too. So the Modi government's having to catch up in that area. However, all of that said, I think there is a reluctance to be too assertive towards China.
Okay.
Even after 2020. So what we saw pre-2020, even after the standoff in Bhutan in 2017, we saw the Modi government trying to establish a modus vivendi, Modi himself trying to establish a kind of a personal relationship with Xi Jinping. All of this, that didn't succeed as well as I think New Delhi wanted it to. And now we're into a situation where I think finally New Delhi has realized that only holding the line militarily is going to work, and trying to pressure China diplomatically may have some effect. But in the end, India is not in the strong position that it would like to be with regard to China. And unfortunately, I think that it's going to be Beijing that will, whatever happens in Beijing is going to affect the relationship more than whatever happens in New Delhi.
That's right. In fact, that we as political writers, I remember one of the lines which I wrote, his relationship with the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping began, on the swings on the banks of a river, Sabarmati River in Ahmedabad in 2014, and has finally deteriorated into hard, cold stares at each other at various international conclaves. Moving on to my last question, we have the elections, and at the moment, everybody is by and large saying that Mr. Modi appears to be in a strong position. Whether he's actually going to be able to touch the 370 mark, which he said, which he announced in Parliament or not. The debate is over that. If Mr. Modi becomes Prime Minister for another term, what do you think would be his likely areas? And also, what would you want him to be focused on? Your verdict on the Modi government's foreign policy.
Okay. I think if I stray from foreign policy just slightly, I mean, I think what everyone who wishes India well wants is for every government to focus on economic and social development first, and to invest as much as can be possibly done to accelerate that as quickly as possible. And that will give India as well more influence, more power, more clout, more standing in the world than perhaps anything else that can be done in foreign policy. The tricky part going into this year and going into this election is that we have so much uncertainty at an international level.
That's right.
We just don't know what's going to happen in the United States. We've got, we've just seen an election in Pakistan. We've got an election coming up in Indonesia. We've got everywhere there is uncertainty. Everywhere we look, I think the Modi government will be better prepared to deal with the Trump administration than it was back in 2017, where I think it, like every other government, found it quite difficult to manage. But I think this time they'll know a little bit better how to handle that. So I would imagine that the relationship with the US could go quite well. There's no light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to China. I think I think that's external circumstances will affect that relationship. But I do hope that New Delhi looks out and tries to focus more, not just on the immediate region, which is hugely important to India and absolutely should be a priority, but also on other parts of East Asia as well. It's clearly had more success in West Asia than in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia now has lost a little bit of confidence in India. Japan, I think, a little bit of confidence too. And given that part of the world is going to be so important in the next few decades, I would like to see India focus on that part of the world a little bit more and try to rebuild some of that confidence that needs to be to make things move forward.
Well, thank you very much. I hope that the team that works with Mr. Modi would have heard the last part of what you said. And thank you very much for coming and actually participating with me. On this entire, we couldn't really cover all the angles of the 360 degree that we tried to do it. The large holes, but then as we said, let this be a teaser for a longer afternoon discussion. Thank you very much for coming and joining me on this program.
Extensive, unbiased, thorough. The Federal Pudhiya Thalaimurai apt nationwide 2024 pre-poll survey gives you the pulse of the nation. 7 p.m. on the Federal's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the Federal's YouTube page for more news and updates.